The biker leader grabbed Chuck Norris by the collar and laughed in his face. "Old man, you just made the worst mistake of your life." His gang surrounded them. 12 leather-clad bikers blocking every exit, knuckles cracking, chains rattling. But what he didn't know was that Chuck Norris holds a black belt in Tang Soo Do, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo, and founded his own martial art called Chun Kuk Do. What happened in the next 60 seconds became the most legendary bar story in Texas history. A story so unbelievable that people still argue about whether it really happened. But the security camera footage doesn't lie. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever stayed calm when someone completely underestimated you, this one's for you. Let's go. It was a quiet Saturday evening in a small town just outside Dallas, Texas, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they thought they did. Chuck Norris had just finished a long week teaching martial arts to underprivileged kids at his local dojo. No cameras, no press, no fanfare. Just him and his mission to give back to the community that raised him. He'd been working with these kids for months, teaching them discipline, respect, self-control. Some came from broken homes. Others had nowhere else to go after school, but Chuck saw potential in every single one of them. After locking up the dojo, he decided to stop by a roadside diner called the Rusty Spoke, a place known for good coffee, decent burgers, and the occasional trouble on Friday nights. It was one of those classic American diners, red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a jukebox in the corner playing old country songs. Chuck walked in wearing faded blue jeans, a plain gray shirt, and a weathered brown leather jacket that had seen better days. No bodyguards, no entourage, no flashy jewelry or designer clothes. Just a man looking for a quiet meal after a long day. He sat down at the corner booth near the window, the one that gave him a clear view of the entire diner. Old habit. Always know your surroundings. He ordered black coffee and a cheeseburger with extra pickles, then pulled out a worn paperback, a book on philosophy he'd been reading for weeks. The waitress, Linda, a kind woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, smiled warmly as she poured his coffee. "You look familiar, hon. You from around here?" Chuck looked up and returned the smile. "Just passing through," he said kindly. "Thanks for the coffee." She nodded, sensing he valued his privacy, and walked away to tend to the other customers. The diner was peaceful. A couple sat in one booth sharing a milkshake. An elderly man read the newspaper. A family with 2 young kids laughed over a plate of fries. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Then, faintly at first, the rumble of motorcycle engines began to echo through the parking lot. 1 bike, then 3, then 5, then 12. The sound grew louder, angrier, like a swarm of metal hornets descending on the diner. Inside, people looked up nervously. The couple stopped talking. The elderly man lowered his newspaper. A biker gang known locally as the Iron Fangs roared into the parking lot, kicking up dust and gravel. They were infamous in smaller towns across Texas, loud, aggressive, running protection rackets and intimidating anyone who stood in their way. Their leader, a hulking man named Vince Crusher Callahan, stood 6'4" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. He wore a spiked leather vest covered in patches, torn jeans, steel-toed boots, and had a jagged scar running down his left cheek, a souvenir from a bar fight years ago. His arms were covered in tattoos. His knuckles were scarred from countless brawls. The gang cut their engines and dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement like hammers. Vince pushed open the diner door so hard it slammed against the wall. "Everyone out. This place is ours tonight." His voice boomed through the diner like a thunderclap. Families scrambled toward the exits. The couple left cash on the table and rushed out the door, not looking back. The elderly man folded his newspaper and quietly slipped out the side entrance. Within seconds, the diner was nearly empty. Linda stood frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling as she gripped a coffee pot. But Chuck didn't move. He calmly turned the page of his book and took another slow sip of his coffee. Vince noticed. His eyes narrowed. "Hey, old-timer, you deaf or just stupid?" Chuck glanced up, his expression calm, unbothered, almost serene. "Just enjoying my coffee." The gang erupted in laughter, slapping each other's backs, mocking the quiet man in the corner. Vince stepped closer, his boots thudding against the floor. "You got guts, Gramps. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered 12-1. Chuck set his coffee down gently and looked Vince straight in the eye. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe numbers don't mean much when you lack discipline." The laughter stopped. Pause here. Comment DIC Pauline if you think respect beats intimidation every time. Vince's smile faded, his jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed into slits. No one talked to him like that. No one. He'd built his reputation on fear, on making sure everyone knew that crossing the iron fangs meant pain. And this old man, sitting there with his coffee and his book, had just disrespected him in front of his entire crew. You think you're smart? Vince growled, stepping even closer. Let's see how smart you are when my boys toss you through that window. He gestured toward the large glass window behind Chuck's booth. Two bikers stepped forward immediately, one with a shaved head and a spider tattoo on his neck, the other with long greasy hair and brass knuckles already on his fingers. They cracked their knuckles in unison, grinning like wolves circling wounded prey. Chuck slowly closed his book and set it down on the table beside his coffee. He folded his hands calmly in front of him and spoke in a voice that was eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes from absolute confidence. I'm going to give you one chance. Walk out of here, apologize to the staff, and we'll forget this ever happened. The room went completely silent. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then Vince threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was loud, mocking, theatrical. He turned to his crew, arms spread wide. Did you hear this guy? He's giving us a chance. The gang joined in laughing, pointing, slapping their thighs. One biker whistled. Another shouted, "This guy's got a death wish." Vince turned back to Chuck, his face twisted into a sneer. You just signed your own death warrant, old man. He nodded to his two enforcers. Teach this fossil a lesson he'll never forget. The first biker, the one with the spider tattoo, lunged forward with surprising speed for a man his size. He threw a wild haymaker aimed directly at Chuck's face. What happened next was so fast, most people didn't even see it. Chuck sidestepped the punch with minimal movement, just a slight shift of his shoulders. The biker's fist sailed past his head, missing by inches. Before the man could recover his balance, Chuck redirected his momentum with a simple wrist control technique, guiding him forward. The biker's own force worked against him. He stumbled, crashed chest, first into the booth, and his head smacked against the wooden backrest with a hollow thud. He slumped to the floor, unconscious before he even realized what happened. Total time elapsed 2 seconds. The second biker hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but pride pushed him forward. He swung a wild haymaker with his brass-knuckled fist, aiming for Chuck's ribs. Chuck saw it coming from a mile away. He ducked low, letting the punch sail harmlessly over his head. Then, with surgical precision, he delivered a single palm strike to the man's solar plexus, the soft spot just below the rib cage. The impact expelled all the air from the biker's lungs in one violent gasp. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream. He crumpled to the floor, gasping like a fish out of water, unable to breathe, unable to move. Chuck stood up slowly, brushing off his jacket. Total time elapsed. 4 seconds, 2 men down. 10 still standing. The diner was dead silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The faint crackle of the radio in the kitchen. Vince's grin disappeared completely. His face turned red. His fists clenched so hard his knuckles went white. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. His voice shaking with a mix of rage and confusion. Chuck didn't answer. He simply picked up his coffee cup, took another slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the table. His expression never changed. Calm, unbothered, in complete control. Linda, still frozen behind the counter, whispered under her breath, but just loud enough for a few people to hear. "Oh my God, that's Chuck Norris." One of the younger bikers, a skinny kid with a patchy beard and nervous eyes, heard her. His face went pale. "Wait, the Chuck Norris?" Another biker, older and more weathered, nodded slowly. "The guy from all those movies?" "No, man," the younger one stammered. "The guy with like 8 black belts. The guy who founded his own martial art. The guy who trained with Bruce Lee." Panic rippled through the gang like wildfire. Feet shuffled. Eyes darted toward the exit. Hands dropped from aggressive postures. But Vince, too proud to back down, too angry to think straight, grabbed a wooden pool cue from the rack on the wall. He gripped it like a baseball bat and stepped forward, his breathing heavy, his eyes burning with humiliation. "I don't care who you are," he snarled. "You just embarrassed me in front of my crew. And nobody does that," and walks away. Chuck stood slowly from the booth. His movements were deliberate, controlled, almost graceful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply looked Vince in the eye and said 5 words that cut through the tension like a blade. Then, you've already lost. Drop it in the comments if you knew this was about to get legendary. Vince gripped the pool cue tighter, his knuckles white with rage. His chest heaved with every breath. Sweat dripped down his scarred face. He'd never been challenged like this. Never been made to look weak in front of his own crew. And he wasn't about to let some old man, legend or not, walk out of here with his dignity intact. You want to play hero? Vince growled. Let's see how tough you are. He swung the pool cue like a baseball bat, aiming directly for Chuck's head with every ounce of strength he had. The wooden cue cut through the air with a sharp whistle. But it never connected. Chuck caught it mid-swing with one hand. The impact echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The pool cue stopped dead in Chuck's grip, completely motionless, as if frozen in time. Vince's eyes widened in disbelief. He pulled back, trying to yank the cue free, but it didn't budge. Chuck's grip was like iron. Then, with a subtle twist of his wrist, Chuck applied pressure to the weakest point of the wood. The pool cue splintered in half with a loud hair-ack. Splinters scattered across the floor. Vince stumbled backward, still holding the broken half, his mouth hanging open in shock. Chuck tossed the other half aside casually, letting it clatter to the ground. Violence isn't strength, Chuck said calmly, his voice steady and firm. It's fear dressed up as power. Vince's face turned crimson. Humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain. His crew stood frozen, watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He couldn't back down now. Not after this. With a guttural roar of pure rage, Vince charged forward like a bull. His massive frame barreled toward Chuck, arms outstretched, intending to tackle him to the ground and beat him senseless. Chuck didn't panic. Didn't flinch. Didn't even raise his hands defensively. He simply waited. Timing is everything. At the last possible second, when Vince was inches away, Chuck moved. He pivoted smoothly to the side, letting Vince's momentum carry him forward. Then, with perfect technique, Chuck delivered a flawlessly executed roundhouse kick. His foot connected with Vince's ribs with a sharp, precise impact. The sound was sickening, a dull thud followed by a wheeze of air being forced from Vince's lungs. The massive biker leader crashed into a nearby table, sending plates, silverware, ketchup bottles, and half-eaten burgers flying in every direction. The table legs buckled under his weight, and the whole thing collapsed beneath him. Vince lay there in the wreckage, groaning, clutching his ribs, struggling to breathe. He tried to push himself up, his arms shaking, his face twisted in pain. Chuck didn't pursue. He didn't stand over him, didn't gloat, didn't taunt. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady, completely composed. I don't want to hurt you, Chuck said quietly, his tone almost compassionate. But I will if you make me. The rest of the gang stood frozen in place, eyes wide, jaws slack. No one moved. No one spoke. One biker with a gray beard and a faded Harley Davidson patch on his vest whispered under his breath, "Dude, we need to leave. Now." Another muttered nervously, tugging at his leather jacket, "I didn't sign up to fight a living legend, man. This is insane." A third biker started slowly backing toward the door, hands raised in surrender, but Vince, blinded by wounded pride and fury, wasn't done yet. He reached down into his boot and pulled out a switchblade. The blade snapped open with a metallic CLK. The room gasped. Linda screamed from behind the counter, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, stop! Someone call the police!" Even some of Vince's own crew looked horrified. "Vince, don't," one of them shouted. "This is going too far!" But Vince didn't listen. His vision was tunneled. His pride was shattered. His reputation was on the line. He staggered to his feet, gripping the knife tightly, his hand trembling with adrenaline and rage. "You think you're untouchable." Vince spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding." Chuck's expression didn't change, but his stance did. In one smooth motion, he shifted into a combat-ready position, weight balanced, center of gravity low, eyes locked on the weapon. His entire demeanor transformed. This wasn't a friendly sparring match anymore. This was survival. "Put it down," Chuck said quietly, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost a whisper. "This is your last warning." Vince ignored him. With a scream of rage, he lunged forward, slashing wildly with the blade. What happened next was almost too fast for the human eye to process. Chuck deflected Vince's knife hand with a precise block, redirecting the blade away from his body. In the same motion, he swept Vince's legs out from under him with a low sweeping kick. Vince's feet left the ground. Before he could react, Chuck controlled his arm, twisted his wrist with a joint lock, and forced him face down onto the floor. The knife clattered harmlessly across the tile, spinning to a stop near the counter. Chuck held Vince pinned to the ground with minimal effort, one knee on his back, one hand controlling his wrist, the other ready to respond if needed. Vince struggled, gasping for air but couldn't move. Chuck's control was absolute. "You done?" Chuck asked calmly, his breathing still steady. Vince, his face pressed against the cold floor, gasping, humiliated, and utterly defeated, finally nodded. "Yeah," he wheezed. "Yeah, I'm done." Chuck released him slowly and stood up. Vince sat up, cradling his wrist, his face bruised, his pride shattered, but alive. He looked up at Chuck with a mixture of fear and respect. "Ooh, who are you, man?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chuck looked him in the eye, his expression calm but firm. "Someone who learned a long time ago that real strength isn't about proving yourself," he said quietly. "It's about protecting others." The weight of those words hung in the air. Comment legendi if you think Chuck just gave the best life lesson of all time. Just as the tension in the diner began to ease, the front door swung open with a loud creak. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the walls in alternating colors. A police cruiser had pulled up outside, lights flashing, engine idling. Two officers stepped out and walked toward the entrance, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. The first officer was young, maybe late 20s, clean, cut with sharp eyes that scanned the room immediately. The second was older, a grizzled veteran in his 50s with gray hair, a thick mustache, and the kind of weathered face that had seen everything twice. They pushed open the door and stepped inside, taking in the scene before them: broken table, shattered pool cue, two unconscious bikers on the floor, one gasping for air, Vince sitting in a pile of wreckage clutching his ribs. The young officer's hand moved closer to his weapon. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said firmly, his eyes moving from the bikers to Chuck. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Vince saw an opportunity. Even in defeat, his instinct was to manipulate, to twist the narrative in his favor. He pointed a shaking finger at Chuck, his voice hoarse but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yeah, that guy right there! He attacked us! He assaulted my men. We were just sitting here minding our own business and he went crazy on us." Some of the bikers nodded quickly, backing up their leader's lie. "That's right, officer," one of them added nervously. "We didn't do anything. This maniac just started throwing punches." Another chimed in. "We want to press charges. He's dangerous." The young officer frowned, his gaze shifting to Chuck with suspicion. He took a step forward, his hand still near his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them," and then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. He tilted his head slightly, studying Chuck's face more closely. Recognition flickered across his expression. "Wait a second," the young officer said slowly, his voice trailing off. "Are you Mr. Norris?" Chuck nodded calmly, his hands still relaxed at his sides. "Evening, officer," he said politely. The young officer's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His hand dropped away from his weapon. His stern expression softened into one of disbelief and respect. "No way," he muttered under his breath. "No way." The older cop, who had been quietly observing from near the door, stepped forward with a knowing smile. He looked at Chuck, then at the bikers, then back at Chuck. He shook his head and chuckled. "Chuck Norris," the veteran officer said, extending his hand. "It's an honor, sir. A real honor." Chuck shook his hand firmly. "Appreciate that," Chuck said humbly. The older cop gestured toward the wreckage around them. "My son trains at your dojo in Dallas," he said warmly. "You've changed his life. Taught him discipline, respect, things I couldn't teach him myself." He turned slowly to face Vince, and the warmth in his voice evaporated instantly. His expression hardened into something cold and unforgiving. "So let me get this straight," the officer said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You and your boys tried to jump Chuck Norris." Vince's face went from angry to pale to terrified in the span of 3 seconds. His mouth opened, but no words came out. One of the bikers stammered, "We didn't know. I swear we didn't know who he was." The young officer crossed his arms, shaking his head in disbelief. "You tried to fight the Chuck Norris," he said. "Are you guys insane?" Another biker protested weakly. "He didn't tell us." "How were we supposed to know?" The older officer cut him off sharply. "Ignorance isn't an excuse," he said firmly. "You threatened innocent people. You destroyed property. You pulled a weapon. He pointed at the switchblade still lying on the floor near the counter. That's assault with a deadly weapon right there. The officer continued. That alone is 5 to 10 years. Vince's face went white as a sheet. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. The older officer looked at Chuck, his expression respectful. You want to press charges, Mr. Norris? He asked. Because we've got enough here to lock every single one of them up tonight. The whole diner held its breath. Linda stood frozen behind the counter, clutching a dish rag. The bikers stood in terrified silence, their eyes darting between Chuck and the officers. Even the young officer waited, pen poised over his notepad, ready to start writing. Chuck looked at Vince, bruised, humiliated, broken, sitting in a pile of wreckage. Then he looked at the rest of the gang. Most of them were young, lost, searching for belonging in all the wrong places. He'd seen men like them before. Hell, he'd been one of them once, angry at the world, looking for respect through fear instead of earning it through character. Chuck took a deep breath and shook his head. No, he said quietly. I don't want to press charges. Vince blinked, stunned. The officers exchanged surprised glances, but Chuck continued, raising a finger. I do have a condition. Everyone leaned in. The diner was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Chuck looked directly at Vince. They clean up this mess. Every piece of broken glass, every overturned table. They apologized to Linda and everyone else here. He paused. And tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, they show up at my dojo. Vince's eyes widened. What? He whispered hoarsely. Chuck's expression softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. You've got energy. You've got strength. You've got loyalty to each other, Chuck said. But you have no direction, no discipline, no purpose. He crossed his arms. I'll teach you how to use what you have the right way. How to channel that fire into something that builds instead of destroys. The room was completely silent. The older officer grinned, clearly impressed. I think that's more than fair, he said, nodding approvingly. The young officer smiled and closed his notepad. Way more than fair, he agreed. Vince stared at Chuck, his throat tight, his eyes glistening. No one had ever given him a second chance before. No one had ever seen past the leather, the scars, the anger. He swallowed hard and nodded slowly. Yes, sir, Vince said quietly, his voice cracking. We'll be there. Type rest if you think mercy is the ultimate power move. The next hour was something none of them would ever forget. The Iron Fangs, a gang that had terrorized small towns across Texas for years, spent 60 minutes on their hands and knees, cleaning up the diner they had just tried to destroy. Vince picked up shattered plates with his bare hands, carefully placing the pieces into a trash bag. The biker with the spider tattoo, now conscious but nursing a massive headache, swept broken glass from the floor with slow, deliberate strokes. The one with brass knuckles wiped down tables, his ribs still aching from Chuck's palm strike. Others overturned chairs back to their proper positions, scrubbed ketchup stains from the walls, and mopped the floor until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Not a single one of them complained. Not a single one of them made excuses. They worked in silence, humbled, ashamed, and for the first time in a long time, aware of the consequences of their actions. Linda watched from behind the counter, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. She'd seen a lot in her years working at the Rusty Spoke, drunks, thieves, troublemakers of all kinds. But she'd never seen anyone like Chuck Norris, and she'd certainly never seen a biker gang willingly cleaning up their own mess. Chuck sat back down in his original booth, sipping his now cold coffee, his book resting on the table beside him. The older police officer sat across from him, shaking his head with a smile. You're something else, Mr. Norris, he said. Most people would have had them arrested without a second thought. Chuck shrugged humbly. Prison teaches fear and resentment, he said. Discipline teaches respect and purpose. I'd rather give them a chance to find the latter. The officer nodded thoughtfully. My son's lucky to have you as a teacher. I'm lucky to have students willing to learn, Chuck replied. After the diner was spotless, cleaner than it had been in months, Vince approached Chuck slowly, hesitantly. His hands were covered in small cuts from picking up broken glass. His leather vest was dirty and torn. His pride was shattered, but his eyes were different now. There was something softer in them, something vulnerable. Mr. Norris, Vince said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I ask you something? Chuck looked up from his book. Go ahead. Vince shifted his weight awkwardly, struggling to find the right words. Why'd you do that? he finally asked. You could have had us all arrested. We had threatened you. We threatened you. We pulled a knife on you. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. You had every right to make us pay. So why didn't you? Chuck closed his book and set it down. He looked Vince straight in the eye, not with judgment, not with pity, but with understanding. Because I've seen men like you before, Chuck said calmly, angry, searching for respect in all the wrong places, looking for a family, for belonging, for something that makes them feel powerful. He leaned forward slightly. I was one of them once. Vince blinked in surprise. You, he said, disbelief evident in his voice. Chuck nodded. I grew up angry at the world, he said. I made mistakes. I fought for the wrong reasons. I hurt people I shouldn't have. He paused, letting the words sink in. But someone gave me a chance. Someone saw past the anger and taught me that real strength isn't about dominance. It's about discipline. It's about protecting others, not proving yourself. Chuck stood up slowly and extended his hand. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m., don't be late. Vince stared at Chuck's hand for a long moment. Then, with tears welling in his eyes, he reached out and shook it firmly. I'll be there, Vince said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise. And I'll bring the others. Chuck nodded. Good, I'll be waiting. As Chuck gathered his things and headed toward the door, Linda rushed out from behind the counter. Mr. Norris, she called out. Wait, your meal, it's on the house. After what you did tonight, it's the least I can do. Chuck smiled warmly and reached into his wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it gently on the counter. Keep it, he said kindly, and keep the change. You've earned it. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Chuck tipped an imaginary hat and walked toward the exit. Outside, the cool Texas night air greeted him. Stars dotted the sky above. The rumble of motorcycles had been replaced by the peaceful sound of crickets chirping. As Chuck climbed into his truck, the young police officer jogged over. Sir, he called out. Just so you know, you're a hero to a lot of us. To a lot of people. Chuck paused, his hand on the truck door, and shook his head humbly. I'm not a hero, son, he said. I'm just a man trying to do the right thing. He started the engine, and that's something anyone can do. With that, Chuck Norris drove off into the night, leaving behind a story that would be told in that small Texas town for generations. A story about strength, about mercy, about second chances, and about what happens when you underestimate a quiet man in the corner booth. Respect isn't earned through fear. It's not earned through intimidation, through violence, or through making others feel small so you can feel big. Real respect is earned through character, through how you treat people when no one's watching, and how you respond when everyone is. Chuck Norris didn't need to prove anything that night. He'd already proven everything that mattered, in the dojo, in his movies, in his decades of martial arts mastery, and most importantly in his life. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. But he chose mercy over punishment. He chose teaching over revenge. He chose to see potential where everyone else saw only threat. And that's what separates legends from everyone else. True strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's not about how many opponents you can defeat, or how much fear you can inspire. True strength is about how much you can lift others up, even when they've tried to bring you down. It's about giving second chances to people who don't deserve them, because you remember when someone gave one to you. It's about using your power not to dominate, but to protect. Not to destroy, but to build. Chuck Norris could have walked away that night and let the law handle Vince and his gang. He could have pressed charges. He could have sent them all to prison, and no one would have blamed him. But instead, he saw 12 lost young men who needed direction more than they needed jail cells. He saw anger that could be transformed into discipline. He saw wasted potential that could be channeled into purpose. And he gave them something no judge ever could, a path forward. Type CCK if you believe humility and power can coexist. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to shout out every single one of you. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. We've got more incredible true stories coming your way. Stories of courage, respect, karma, and redemption. Stories that remind us what it means to be strong, to be kind, and to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. Let us know in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Was it the moment Chuck caught the pool cue mid-swing? The roundhouse kick that sent Vince crashing? Or the moment he offered mercy instead of revenge? Tell us what you loved most, so we can keep bringing you the content that inspires you. Until next time, stay humble, stay strong, and never underestimate the quiet ones, because the most dangerous people in the room are often the calmest. We'll see you in the next one.